Good morning, everybody. Here we go. All right. Good morning, everybody. Justin Dunaway here with the Institute of Clinical Excellence, coming at you live from Portland, Oregon. I'm shooting on two cameras, so I'm going to bounce back and forth, but we got live on Instagram, live on Facebook. So here we go. So today, I'm calling an audible. My plan for this morning was to talk about mindset and its effects on total health. But then about a week ago, I read this study that absolutely blew my mind, and I wanted to talk about it in front of all of you today. But for the mindset stuff, I'm going to be jamming on that this weekend at the Sampler. So if you are signed up for the Sampler, I'm going to go and deep dive into mindset and total health during my session anyway. If you're not signed up for the Sampler, make sure you check that out. It's virtual this year, but the Sampler is my favorite weekend of the year. It's all of the faculty. We're going to get together, and we're all going to be rapping about some of our favorite stuff for 2 days, so you get a little bit of everything from all of us. And now that it's virtual, you get a ton of live content. There's also a bunch of pre-recorded stuff, so there's way more stuff packed into the Sampler this year than any year previous. So it's going to be an awesome weekend. If you're not into that yet, make sure you check that out. So today, like I said, calling an audible, shifting gears, want to talk about the unseen risks and consequences of surgery. But before I get into this study that kind of just blew my mind and got me shifting gears here, I want to frame it a little bit. So we're going to talk about this stuff in the context of FAI surgery, femoral impingement surgery. And it starts with Mike Ryman back in 2015 in a nice commentary. Basically, he said, he kind of shot up the warning flare, and he said this. The study was FAI surgery, moving too fast, too far beyond the evidence. And what Mike said here was, we've got this huge increase of FAI diagnoses. We're doing MRIs on everybody. We're seeing impingement in a ton of people, and we're seeing a ton of surgeries on these patients. What we don't have yet is a ton of research that says this is the right approach or not. And all Mike is saying is, let's pump the brakes a little bit. Let's slow down and really make sure that the stuff we're doing is the right stuff. And he said, we don't want to go down the same road with the hip that we went with scoping knees for arthritis, scoping knees for minor meniscus tears, doing subacromial decompressions, repairing every rotator cuff. And he's right. We have learned some pretty hard lessons over the last few years on that, or the last 10 years or so on that. I mean, we've got research that shows, for every cortisone injection in the knee, you increase your risk of total knee replacement by 10%, and that stacks with each injection. We know that in the absence of mechanical locking giving way, scoping the knee for a meniscus tear is probably not the right approach anyway. We know that subacromial decompressions for shoulder pain in comparison to conservative management just doesn't hold a lot of water. We see the same stuff with rotator cuff pairs, and we know the stats behind fusions are abysmal, right? So we know that a lot of these non-traumatic, non-time dependent orthopedic surgeries just don't hold a lot of water. So this commentary is just saying, let's pump the brakes and make sure we're not in the same boat with the FAI surgeries. It was back in 2015. So where are we at? What does the research say at this point? Well, we had a nice systematic review, meta-analysis of the evidence for conservative versus surgical management come out this year, Dwyer 2020. And first of all, there's still not a ton of research yet. That there were only, in this meta-analysis, they could only include 3 studies that were done well enough to talk about, and the N isn't that great. Not a huge amount of patients. But the evidence is starting to show that maybe the surgical intervention does edge out conservative management a little bit when we look at the International Hip Outcome Tool. In this meta-analysis, pulling all the results, it looked like about 51% of people who got surgery achieved clinically relevant outcomes to the 30% that didn't get the surgery, conservative management, those 30% had clinically relevant outcomes. And then we look at what they called acceptable symptomatic states. Again, 48% in the surgical group and about 20 in the non-surgical group achieved that. So, though that's not really great. I mean, at best, it's a coin flip, right? For just a little bit of a bump in the hip outcome tool. Now, when we look at those 3 studies, there's one of them I want to highlight just a little bit, the Mansell study in 2018. They did FAI surgeries on 40 people or conservative management on 40 people and tracked them for 2 years. But you got to realize that in the conservative management group, 28 of those patients jumped into the surgical group early on. Another 11 dropped, or another 12 dropped out. So we're really only comparing 40 surgeries versus 10 conservative management. And at the 2-year mark, every single one of the patients, no matter which arm you were in, said that they were the same before the study started. So the surgery didn't do anything, conservative management didn't do anything, and it was in a military population. And of those that were active military, a third of the patients in each group were no longer fit for duty at 2 years. Now, we'll take that one step further and realize that part of the issue may be that patients are walking in the door, we're doing an MRI, we're seeing stuff on the MRI, and we're changing it, and that may not be the issue. 2015 systematic review looking at asymptomatic individuals in their MRIs, we find that 37% have cam deformities, 67% have pincer deformities, 68% in the general population with no pain at all, asymptomatics, have labral damage on an MRI. So John wakes up on Monday, his hip hurts, he goes into the doc, they say, oh, let's get an MRI, boom, look, you've got a pincer deformity, let's get you in and clean that up. That may not even be the issue at all. The other issue that we could talk about all day is what were the protocols? What were the conservative management? What was the loading? What did they actually do for these treatment? Was this the cutting edge stuff? Was this the right conservative management for these patients? I don't want to dive into that today. I don't want to dive deep into the treatment. What I want to say though is that there are some people leading the charge in treating these patients conservatively. The people that jump to my mind are Sarah Heron and Zach Long. If you're not following them and you're treating this population, that is a really great source for what are the protocols for conservative management for these patients. The two of them put out a really nice ebook on this population, free. I'll throw the link to it in the show notes here. If you're listening on Instagram, make sure you pop over to our Facebook page to see to grab these links. But there'll be a link to their ebook on treating it. What I want to talk about, because when we look at this from a benefit perspective, whether we're talking about conservative management or surgical intervention, it's not great benefit. From a surgical perspective, only 51% of patients who received surgery did a little bit better. And only 30% of patients in the conservative management group did a little bit better. And a whole handful of them said, I'm no better 2 years later than I was before any of this started. So from a benefit perspective, we got a long way to go, right? We're not doing great on either side of the coin. But when we look at treatment, we really should look at all treatments through the lens of risk benefit, right? And we know the benefit right now isn't that great. I really believe that the right conservative management, those stats change a fair amount. So I really encourage you to check out what Zach and Sarah are doing. But from a risk perspective, I want to talk about that a little bit. And this is the study that absolutely blew my mind 2 weeks ago that made me totally shift gears on today's talk. From Rhone, R-H-O-N in 2019, and I'll throw a link in the show notes for the study as well. But it was comorbidities in the first 2 years after hip arthroscopic surgery. So these are patients that had FAIs on an MRI and went in and got a arthroscopic surgery. Now, this was done in a military health setting, not all active duty, but everybody was young, 18 to 50, and yes, I'm considering 50 young, and it was 1,870 patients, so a big group of patients. But what's really cool about this study is since it's in the military health system, they've got stats and demographics on everybody through a long period of time. And it makes it really easy to do some cool research. So what they said is, we know that there are a bunch of comorbid factors that are prognostic indicators of poor outcomes. So let's take a look at everybody's status on those indicators. And they were able to look at what is your baseline comorbid status 1 year prior to your surgery. And then let's check back in 2 years later to see if the surgery had an effect on your comorbid status, which is interesting because we don't have any research that has looked at that before. What we typically do is measure your comorbid status and then look at your surgery, look at your outcomes, and then see if the comorbid status had an effect on that. This flipped the script. What this study does is, how does this surgery change those comorbid factors? So the 7 factors that they looked at were this: substance abuse, cardiovascular disorders, mental health disorders, metabolic syndrome disorders, sleep disorders, systematic arthropathy, and chronic pain disorders. And they just tracked, they got the baseline for how many people in the cohort had these things, and then how many of the people in the cohort had these things 2 years later. And the stats on this are mind-boggling. So after establishing the baseline 1 year prior to surgery, checking back in 2 years after the surgery, we saw, I'm going to read the stats to you, we saw a 57% increase in cases of substance abuse. That's pretty terrible. But it gets worse. We have 71% increase in cardiovascular disorders, an 84% increase in cases of mental health disorders, 86% increase in cases of metabolic syndrome disorders, 111% increase in sleep disorders, 132% increase in systemic arthropathy, and 166% increase in the rate of chronic pain disorders 2 years following your hip surgery. Now again, this study is done in the hip. I would bet that this is generalizable to a lot of the orthopedic surgeries that are not time dependent, that are non-traumatic, that we're jumping into. I think it's really important, and what the authors said in this study towards the end, and they said it very bluntly, which I loved, was this. They said that we typically don't look at these things as consequences of surgery. We look at these things as prognostic indicators. But we should. We absolutely should. We need to do more research here. We need to start establishing this baseline of these comorbid, of these psychosocial, of these physiologic comorbidities that we know are indicators of poor total health. And then we need to check back in on these after these surgeries. What we're probably going to find is that there are some really terrible, unseen risks and consequences of surgery that we haven't looked at. Now, from a clinical perspective, what does that mean for us? Well, first off, I think it's important to realize that what I'm not saying here is that all surgery is bad. Right? The right surgery for the right patient at the right time can make a world of difference. Right? There's no debating that. A lot of these surgeries are well overdone, and there's tons of patients that are getting them that don't need them, and we haven't done the right stuff first. But I'm not saying that all surgery is bad. What I'm saying is that we absolutely have to treat the patient, not the image, right? We know, just like in every other body part, in the neck, in the shoulder, in the knee, in the back, now in the hip, we know that there are large amounts of stuff showing up on MRI in absolutely asymptomatic populations, which means that there's a high percentage chance that the stuff you walk in through the door with has absolutely nothing to do with the image, right? So we have to treat the patient, not the image. But we also have to do, from a conservative management perspective, we have to be doing everything in our power to avoid these surgeries at all costs. Again, the right surgery for the right patient, but these are not time dependent. We can spend some time with these patients. We need to get in and do the right stuff early, and we need to give it enough of an effort. We need to spend enough time with these patients to make sure that they're truly failing conservative management before we move on. Now, again, from a treatment perspective, what should we be doing with these patients? Well, it's probably a little bit more involved than a lot of the conservative management studies are doing with these patients. And like I said, I think for my money, Zach and Sarah are leading the charge in this field. I would, if you were not an expert in management of FAI stuff and you're seeing a lot of these patients, check in, see what they're doing, and if they're doing something different, ask some questions, figure out what are they doing that we should be implementing with these patients in our clinics. But we need to be looking for the best approach and spending enough time for these patients to keep them off that surgical table. Last, we absolutely have to get into the patient's heads, right? We know, and I say this all the time, beliefs and expectations and the foundation that outcomes are built on. And we've got some evidence from the surgical perspective. There's a really cool study that looked at a large cohort of patients with chronic full thickness rotator cuff tears that got 12 weeks of conservative management. 75% of them did great, didn't go on to need surgery. 25% of them failed, went on, needed the surgery. And then when they went in and looked at the factors that were prognostic for surgery in this 25% that failed conservative management, and they looked at duration of symptoms, size of the tear, disability, pain, activity levels, age, comorbid status, all of that stuff. The number one indicator for failing conservative management was belief that conservative management couldn't help you, right? So we know that when the patient walks in the door with low expectations, with poor mindset, with poor belief structure, this stuff needs to be identified, addressed, and changed. We have to get the patient to buy into what we're doing if we want them to have the opportunity to actually benefit from what we're doing. And that, again, I'm going to dive deep into that stuff on the sampler this weekend, but just realize that that's a huge piece of it. I'm not saying that that's all of it. Like, we have to be doing the appropriate loading, the right treatment, but we've also got to get the patient on board. At the end of the day, though, the important piece of the last 15 minutes of the ramble here is this. There are unseen risks and consequences of orthopedic surgeries that are just starting to come to light. Stuff that we haven't thought about. The substance abuse disorders, cardiovascular stuff, mental health, depression, chronic pain. This is the stuff that we're treating all day long, right? When we look at the most unhealthy people on the planet, this is the stuff that they're built out of. And what we're seeing is that surgery creates this stuff. Surgery has the ability to enhance this stuff. The surgery has the ability to create more and more of these things that now build into poor prognosis and poor health for these patients. We have to do everything in our power to keep humans off the surgical table when appropriate. All right, that's all I got on this topic. If you're not signed up for the sampler this weekend, I would highly suggest you check it out. This is my favorite weekend of the year. I get to listen to all of my favorite humans on the planet talk about their favorite stuff all weekend. So check it out. I'll throw a link in there to the show notes as well. Otherwise, have an awesome week, and I hope to see you virtually this weekend at the sampler. Thanks for listening.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.